Good evening. Good evening. It is the 9th session of the Free University Brighton Plato and Deleuze course. And we got one more session after this, and so I'm going to use these last couple of sessions to not sum up, that's not really the right word, to try and give us some food for thought, to try and pin some of that stuff down into the Sophist and to locate it around our reading of the Sophist, and to give a kind of a couple of indications, as I say, of food for thought, where to go next, what we might want to do next if we were to continue our study of these ideas and these texts. So this week I'm going to chat about 4 different sort of elements of this. I'm going to mention and talk about the city and some of the issues around that. I'm going to talk a little bit about deception. I'm going to talk about the philosopher and the divine, and I'm going to talk about the changing nature of subjective relations. But all of this is within a context of the title here, Organisation and Reorganization. This is something I've mentioned a couple of times now, and it's a point I'm kind of increasingly thinking is important. And the point basically is this: if we begin to think of Plato as an origin, then we forget the context in which the arguments are being produced. And if we forget the context in which the arguments are being produced, then we become subject to the frame. What I mean by that is that there's a certain context, there's a certain sort of set of assumptions that are framing the questions that Plato has put forward, and the kind of arguments he's making. There's a certain set of assumptions and a frame within which those are kind of operating, and if we don't notice that frame, then we become beholden to it. We become subject to it in that sense. We kind of, no matter what we do, we're going to be continuously kind of caught in that kind of frame. And I think the best way that I can think of articulating that at the moment is to think of Plato as engaged in an organisation and a reorganisation of something that's already organised. So there's already a particular sort of, there's already what I call pre-Socratic philosophers. There's already a whole bunch of other ways of doing philosophy. There's a whole bunch of other ways of thinking, ways of reasoning, and so it's not as though Plato initiates thinking or initiates thought. That's a kind of common problematic that we encounter inside philosophy, where Plato is taken to be this kind of honest, sincere, I'll come back to that word towards the end of the lecture maybe, honest, sincere starting point, the first time these thoughts have kind of been produced in this coherent, rational, step-by-step way of thinking and arguing about stuff. And that kind of picture of Plato is quite problematic. Now, there's lots of different ways in which this problem can be kind of dealt with, but I think, as I say, the best way is to think about what Plato's doing is trying to organise and reorganise something that isn't empty, that's already organised, and it's the reorganisation, I think, that he's doing that is important. Why is he reorganising in a particular kind of way? Why, for example, is the appearance-reality distinction so crucial? Why is this relationship to the divine so crucial? Why does he feel a need to kind of pinpoint and select out the Sophist and the Statesman from the philosopher? Why do I mention the Statesman? Originally, this course was going to look at the Phaedrus, the Sophist, and the Statesman, and this is the first time this course has run, and it's going to obviously need a little bit of adjustments as things go along, but we haven't managed to get to the Statesman. But the Statesman is a text that immediately follows the Sophist. It's in the same context, and it's almost a kind of continuation of the conversation that the visitor is having with Theaetetus in the Sophist. This kind of continues. There's a slight change of interlocutors. We get the young Socrates in the Statesman instead of Theaetetus. But in both cases, the Statesman and the Sophist are kind of very, very close. And we'll see that towards the end today, as we get to the kind of point at which Socrates, as we get to the point at which the visitor from earlier, not Socrates, not Plato, the visitor, when we get to the point at which he's defining and sort of finally pinpointing where the Sophist is, it's right next door to the Statesman, and it's all to do with relationships to deception. So let's begin. Let's begin with the beginning. Let's begin. I'm just going to try and put my phone clock up, because I can't actually see a clock for some reason on my screen. Anyway, there we go. So let's begin with this issue of the city. Now, I brought it up at the start. Right at the start of the course, I mentioned the city because it's something that kind of I wanted to talk about more in seminars and maybe in other bases, but obviously, other people are involved in those, and we have other issues that they want to talk about. So I've not really developed it much. But if you remember, in the first lectures, I was talking to you about the way in which the Phaedrus, the first text from Plato that we read, the way in which the Phaedrus is set up, it's staging. The phrase mise en scène is sometimes used for the idea of staging, but there's a kind of staging that's done in the Phaedrus. Much less of that is in the Sophist and the Statesman, but in the Phaedrus there's quite a sort of it's quite a whole like preliminary act in which Socrates is meeting Phaedrus. They're going for a walk outside the city. They find this nice little bit of riverbank to sit on. It finishes with the end of the dialogue finishes with them with offering, thanks and blessings and a prayer to the space and the spirits around them in this, and the setting is basically the countryside outside of the city. And in the context of setting that up, one of the things we find Socrates doing is saying, well, actually, I don't learn anything from nature. I learn from people in the city. And at the start of the Sophist, whilst there's much less staging going on, there's much less of this scene setting, there's still a reference to this kind of relationship to the city. And right at the beginning of the Sophist, we find philosophers are said to haunt the cities. And this is supposedly something that comes from Homer. And you can find this at 216c in the Sophist, 216c. If you want to check that out and look it up. And so thanks for the follow, Cosmic Dreamer. So the city is this kind of place that we encounter in these moments, and these are very limited moments, so let's not draw hasty conclusions, but it seems to be that the city is encountered as something in which knowledge is able to be found, whereas the countryside, the rural plants, animals, etc., nothing can be learnt from those. And so the philosophers are kind of in the city and related to the city as places in which they can learn, in places in which they can talk. Now, that divide between the human and nature, the city or the rural divide, that kind of divide is such a deep-rooted and fundamental divide, and it's sometimes difficult for us to quite realise, I think, what that does. Now, that's not to say that there's some perfect human situation pre-cities in which we're all doing wonderfully. There's no original perfection that's then somehow, or I'm not suggesting that there's an original perfection which is somehow then destroyed by the cities. But what I am wanting to point to is the way in which what we think of as the human, what we think of as our kind of way of being, is obviously quite drastically changed when we develop and begin to place cities as sort of central elements of our culture, central elements of the kind of being that we are, the human being. But in some sense, what changes with the city is what it means to be human. And this, I think, is kind of the point I want to really kind of emphasize here. It is I think that relationship to what it is to be human that alters very drastically. I can't see how that couldn't be the case, but it alters drastically when the city sort of develops. It doesn't destroy or lose the previous kind of ways of being human, but it brings about a whole new set of structures, a whole new set of ways of being organised, ways in which our bodies and our habits and our language and our education and our knowledge, ways in which those are organised are changed once the city is there. And in some sense, they're changed by something that's beyond the human. I mean, that's what's kind of crucial here. It's not as though these are changes. These are not changing our human nature or what it is to be human. It's not, maybe not even use the notion of nature. The city is not changing what it is to be human through some sort of set of rational decisions, but through a mix of habits and decisions and limitations that are made inside that kind of development. We might almost say organic development of the city. Now, that's disingenuous in a way, because we do know that there's probably a whole series of kind of decisions around imposing cities on areas. But the point is that once these machines of the cities are working, then the way we eat, the way we wash our clothes, the way we sleep, the way we entertain ourselves, the way we learn, all of these things are quite drastically different from a pre-city kind of situation. And so the city does more than just produce a geographical location. It produces a kind of conceptual limit location as well. There are certain things that can be done in the city that can't be done without the city. There are certain things that can't be done with the city that can only be done outside. There are things we could possibly identify that are kind of included and excluded. And I think it's in this situation that we need to think about Plato. We need to think about Plato as, I think, trying to deal with issues that might be said to arise in the human, but more specifically arise in the human who lives in a city. And so one of the definitions we might want to sort of have of who is it that Plato is talking about are humans who live in cities. That's what Plato is talking about. This is one of the reasons perhaps why you can't learn anything, as he says in the Phaedrus, you can't learn anything from nature, because in a sense he's not interested in that particular element of what he can learn. What he's interested in is what can be learned in relationship to other human beings in the city. So the human is a kind of, it's limited and produced by the city in a particular kind of way. Now that's not a unique point. My interest in this nation of the city came via Deleuze and Guattari, who linked to an author called Lewis Mumford. And Lewis Mumford has this idea about the city as an implosion event. And so once the city takes form, it reorganizes the space around it. So you have this kind of city in the middle, and then everything is going in towards it. So everything's being drawn in. So trade, food, people for work. There's a kind of flow inwards, and it kind of, in a sense, there's a weight the city has within its local area that recontextualizes all of that local area as well as the city. And I think it's that kind of, it's analogy, in analogy to that I want to think about the way in which Plato is developing his philosophy. There's also other elements that the city brings, as well as just a reorganization, sort of a new context. The very element of concentration of people, the very element of concentration of labour power and human power. This has a kind of radical, a radical shift, I think, in what it is we're capable of seeing in the world. One of the things that's curious about cities is the way in which you often find these kind of skylines. You often find this idea of a city skyline. And there's almost no better way of kind of thinking about the way we're kind of claiming a chunk of nature. We're kind of locating a kind of a human kind of not an imposition, but it when we see a skyline, we see human. And yet what we're seeing is something that, in a sense, we take to be a natural fact, the human. But what we're seeing is the kind of humans that we are, which are exactly the kind of humans that are produced by cities. And so cities, in a sense, give us this sense of a false sense, perhaps, but they give us this sense of being at home. In a way that perhaps for a lot of people who live in cities, the countryside can't possibly offer them that kind of sense of being at home. But there's also, as well as concentration, this change in context, things like what we might call massification. And so there's this, what sometimes we might refer to today as stuff that is dealt with by big data. And what that is that there are within the city, huge flows that have huge effects Obviously, in our contemporary city, these are sort of traffic flows, but flows of food and also, crucially, flows of waste. Massive difference between how you deal with something once it becomes a kind of massified thing. There's a difference between camping, let's say, popping out to the camp and then going out to have a wee or a poo in the garden, in the woods, and digging a little hole, and that's perfectly fine. And if there's maybe 10 of you at the campsite, again, it's perfectly fine. And if you move on, if you get something like Glastonbury and you get 250,000 people on a campsite, if you don't seriously organise how you're going to deal with your waste, then you're going to have a massive problem. And so that there's a point at which the scale of things alters how you can deal with them. And the same thing inside a city, I think. There's a point at which the scale of the way a city operates alters how we deal with each other as humans. It's much more difficult to deal with another human being as an individual within the city. They're a kind of face of a generic thing, a city dweller. And so I think one of the things that we want to keep in mind when we're trying to deal with Plato, when we're trying to deal with his arguments, is something like the question of how to think in a city, how to think with the city, and to think in that sort of situation about what's the problem. Now, very briefly, one of the ways in which the problem might be defined is that, for example, what were previously one-to-one or very small relationships, perhaps in a small group of human beings, so relationships, let's say, of power, of who's in charge and who's following and who's being told what to do and who's doing the telling, those kind of relationships change quite drastically once they scale up into a city, and we begin to get this thing that we call politics. But once that happens, what actually perhaps really happens is that politics becomes something that is more diverse. So you get capital P politics, what we might think of as everyday politics, done on a stage, done for an audience, done as a kind of drama or a kind of theatrical presentation almost, because it has to be, because there's an audience to watching this, and there's a kind of relationship of I wouldn't say manipulation, but there's a relationship in which the performers are trying to get the audience to do something like vote for them, and so politics becomes this kind of big performative process, so politics with a big P. And yet at the same time, as we can all, I suppose, be well aware that there's still power dynamics going on inside familial relationships, inside working relationships, inside relationships with lovers or friends, politics with a small p. So there's kind of relationships that might take place, or you might be familiar with at work with co-workers, or in a project that you're working on with other people. And yet another layer is that there, so we have capital P politics and small p politics, and perhaps this split between big politics and micro politics or small politics, perhaps this split is connected to the city as well. But also there's another P, the psychic or the psyche. The mind becomes the psyche, the psychology of what happens to you inside a city. That also becomes an element. So when we talk about the problem, we might, what's the problem of the city? Well, in some sense, it's perhaps this split between politics with a big P and politics with a small p, between the kind of way in which power is operating. So that might be one of the big problems that we encounter. And the other problem is the way in which individuals are operating. And again, that might be, again, a PP sort of divide. We might be thinking there of the way in which, privacy begins to develop outside of the public. And there's a kind of public realm, private realm. There's a kind of politics with a capital P realm, politics with a small p realm. And there's these kind of splits between different elements, depending upon at which scale we're working. So if we're working at the scale of the city, if we're talking about the council elections or the mayoral elections or something like that, we're working at one scale. If we're talking about, who's deciding what we have for dinner, we're talking about a different kind of scale. And there's a kind of separation out of these different elements, so that one begins to be politics and the other begins to be just everyday life. And we kind of, it's within that context, I think, that someone like Plato is beginning to think. And I think it's within this context that we need to try and think of the city, or at least that kind of context in which we are thinking, as having a crucial effect in limiting or opening up options for what it is we're able to think in the future, what kind of arguments we're able to make, and also why some arguments seem to be important. Now, which arguments seem to be important? Well, unsurprisingly perhaps, I mean, we're talking about philosophy here, so unsurprising perhaps, but some of the arguments that seem crucially important are arguments around deception. Now, often we might want to frame these in terms of truth and falsity, but that's really quite simplistic, I think. Are there true things and are there false things? Yes, without a doubt. Do they matter? Mostly not. That seems to be the best way of thinking about it. In most of the time, when there's a false statement that's made, someone's just made an error. So when the statements are in the Sophist, for example, towards the end of the discussion around deception there, which is sort of about 3/4 of the way through, the visitor from Elia talks to Theaetetus, and when they're talking about different sentences are true or false, it sort of says there's one here, Theaetetus sits, and there's another sentence here, Theaetetus flies, and this one, Theaetetus flies, is false because it's not, this is not what's happening in the world, this is not what's going on in reality. And what that does is it tries to suggest that there's this huge difference between the language, Theaetetus flies, and the reality. But in fact, if we actually were to think about at any point at which someone might say something like that outside of this argument, where they might actually carry out an actual act of deception, if that was the kind of thing that they'd said, we would just think of them as being mistaken. You've made a mistake. You've made an error. And there's no value judgment really in that. It's not that somehow they're deceiving anyone. And so one of the things that's kind of crucial about deception is that it's not capable, it's not enough for us to think that truth and falsity and deception are the same thing. There's something radically different going on. And a lot of the time, attempts to try and break down deception into just, the fact that there can be falsities and therefore people can lie, which is one of the things that's going on inside the Sophist. In order to just do that seems a bit disingenuous, because it's not really looking at the actual situation of deception. What it's looking at is an error, a situation of error or mistake. An error or mistake is not deception. So at the very least, we might want to say that the deception is something like, or lying, let's call it lying. Lying is something like a falsity plus something else. There must be something else going on. And that's something else we might want to just easily sort of say is intention to deceive, but that's a little bit circular. I'm lying because I'm intending to lie. I mean, that's almost what it's saying. So that's not really enough, I don't think. Inside the Sophist, we come across one of the assumptions that Plato is using, and there's an assumption that's kind of there through much philosophy, and it's an assumption that is not really challenged until someone like Nietzsche or Freud, and this assumption is that people aren't willfully ignorant. People aren't willfully ignorant of things. Ignorance is thought to be like a false move, a soul's false move on its way to knowledge, and education is the cure for ignorance. And ignorance in that sort of situation, there's no willful ignorance. So ignorance is just a kind of mistake. Okay, it's a kind of error, it's a kind of false step, and education is there to either, the Sophists, they suggest there's two ways. Education is there either to sort of, habituate you into the right step, or it's there to sort of enable you to show yourself that you've made a mistake. And usually we kind of work with the latter one in today. We try and get, education is a process by which we kind of see for ourselves how things work and how we might have been making a mistake. Underlying that, the idea that there's no willful ignorance is this sense that everyone's kind of good intentioned. We're all in it for good intentions. We're all trying to, find out how the world is, find out how things work, and philosophy's job is just to kind of do it a little bit more systematically, to do it consistently, to get used to the places where we make missteps, and so it can kind of warn people of where they might take place. Now, the sophist is going to be someone, despite the fact that Plato says no one's willfully ignorant, the sophist is going to be someone who essentially has, is ignorant but has the conceit of knowledge. And so there's already a kind of complicated situation here, because it's not like the sophist or the statesman are simply making a mistake, and it's not really enough to just say that they're intending to lie. The question is still why. What's going on here? And so I think one of the things we need to kind of think about is the way in which the sophist is articulated as, at one point, a character who wants to have disputes, who wants to have arguments, who kind of isn't interested at getting at a truth, is extremely good at just countering any point presented to them and making the person, let's say person A, says, I think the world is produced by the gods, and the sophist produces a series of arguments through questioning and answering that tries to sort of make them feel like that isn't true, it isn't capable of being held true, or perhaps they have to hold something else that they already reject as true in order to hold that true. And so they're trying to engage, it seems, in a practice that isn't aimed at the truth. This is the kind of charge laid against the sophist. They're engaging in disputation for the disputation's sake, argument for argument's sake. And quite often that, no doubt, is an image that people have of academics and the way in which academics operate. I think the phrase is, that's a very semantic argument. I can hear that. I hear that when people say, say the person who's the academic who's making an argument is nitpicking, and they're doing it not really because they've got any interest in the truth. They're just doing it to sort of for egoistic reasons, or they're doing it for career reasons, or they're doing it for some other reasons other than the truth. And this seems to be at the crux of what the sophist is doing. There seems to be this selection between a person who's engaging in argument for the truth and a person who's engaging in argument for argument's sake. And the difficulty is they both look the same. They both look the same, or at least that seems to be the case. It seems to be, very difficult to work out. In fact, if we take the end of the sophist seriously, they both look the same by design. The sophist kind of looks like the philosopher by design. Now, what's kind of curious here is, in what situation would we ever encounter this? What are the conditions in which we must live for this kind of deception to be capable of being successful? If the scam artist, lives next door and tries to scam you, then they're a fool. The scam artist depends upon a kind of anonymity, and that anonymity itself depends upon something like the city. It depends upon something like an organization of human beings in which, whilst I know the person I'm talking to is a human being, I don't actually know any more, really. I have no real capacity on which to base trust or my relationship with them, because that relationship is going to be very temporary. Okay, it's going to be a ship's meeting in the light rather than the night, perhaps. It's going to be one of those kind of temporary moments. And in that temporary moment, in that transient relationship, which I think is one of the things that we begin to see inside the city, this kind of transience of relationship. In that transient relationship, If I take seriously something that the other person is saying, then in taking it seriously, I kind of enter something that is beyond that transience. I kind of take it seriously, and it opens up a kind of different future. So if I buy, a house off someone and then it's a scam, then what I've lost is not just the immediate relationship. I've lost that kind of future that I was reorganizing myself towards. If I take my teaching from them in terms of the sophists, telling me about being and not being, for example. It's not just in that moment, it's the fact that I will go on to reproduce that, the fact that I will go on to try and use that, the fact that I will orientate myself with those arguments and those thoughts. And so there's this kind of situation in which we have to kind of think ourselves into a structure of society in which deception actually matters, and to try and think about whether this is very context bound to specific ways of organising our life, specific ways of organising human life. And my suggestion is that yes, I think it's much more closely related to the way in which people organise their life inside cities, or the way in which the way in which cities organise human life, as kind of transience, as concentration of labour and power, as kind of massification of processes, and in which, in a sense, we're not necessarily alienated from some original nature, but in which the kind of being that we're capable of being is one who is capable of being deceived. One in which one is a space in which one is capable of being successfully deceived. Here it's there's a distinction that we might want to make that I think is a generous way of understanding Plato, and I'd like to try and understand him generously, in which what the philosopher is doing is not just making an argument. They're trying to think, and there's a difference here. Whereas what the sophist is doing is not trying to think, they're just trying to make an argument. And for the person who's trying to think, there's no loss possible. A good conversation is going to produce perhaps more thinking, more thought than a poor conversation, but any attempt to think is a positive move. The only thing that's not positive here is not attempting to think. Whereas within an argument is structured a bit like a competition or a zero-sum game. So there's going to be winners and losers, and the distinction between that, the distinction between trying to think and trying to argue, and the philosopher using arguments in order to think, and the sophist using arguments not in order to think. That distinction perhaps is something like the easiest, most comfortable way I would try and express what Plato is attempting to articulate with this really quite strange distinction between the sophist and the wise. Okay, I'm going to take a pause for 5 minutes, so have yourself a little stretch, and then I'll come back at 7:39. Okay. Let's return to the chat. So, I suppose to summarise, the idea I want to push into your mind is to think about what the conditions for deception are, given that deception is such a central problematic for Plato. And my suggestion is that deception itself is something that we're far more familiar with in terms of a city structure. So not that cities produce deception, rather they are part of the enabling of conditions in which deception can work. Now, one of the things that's going on here is, and this is a lesson from Deleuze and Guattari from schizoanalysis, as they call it, is whenever we encounter speech, what we need to also do is kind of think of it as one part of a double. That there's a set of ways of talking on the one hand, and there's a set of ways of doing things on the other hand. And if the ways of doing things, don't enable certain things to be said, then literally they can't be said, or they can't be said meaningfully. So, I mean, perhaps the easiest example to think of about what I'm talking about here. So, language and bodies go together. The way in which bodies are organised. One of the easiest ways of thinking about this is to think of a courtroom. Okay, there are certain things that can be said in that courtroom, such as "you are guilty," that can perhaps be said elsewhere, but don't have the same kind of implications. So they're structured differently. And there are certain things that can be said in the courtroom that can't be said outside. Like, I am sentencing you to 30 months in prison. Something that happened to me years ago. Now that sentencing sentence, it's a strange thing, but that can only be said in that particular way, in that particular set of like organised bodies, in particular set of relationships. And so whenever we're looking at some argument, if we take it away from the way in which the bodies, are organised, then what we're doing is we're not seeing the limits to what can be said and what can be meaningful. We're taking them to somehow be completely autonomous and universal and abstract, and we're essentially putting language into that realm of the transcendental, the realm of the transcendent rather, and the realm of forms, the realm of ideas, and we're treating language as an idealistic object. Whereas if we were, and that difficulty means that we lose all friction, we lose all contact with reality, and all of language becomes a kind of, self-referential, systematic pool of, various statements. And in a sense, this is one of the problems that I think Plato is trying to push us towards. Remember the distinction between arguments and thinking. Okay, let's try and work with that. So if the sophist is capable of essentially playing the game extremely well, perhaps better than the philosopher, but they've got no interest in anything other than just winning the game, they don't have any great interest other than that, then all you're ever going to learn from the sophist is how to win the game. But what game? The sophist presents this as the game of knowing, the game of knowing how the world is. And so you might think, well, what I'm going to win is knowledge of how the world is. But in fact, what you're going to win is nothing ever other than the game, the particular instance of the argument in which you're engaged. And so you may win all the arguments in your in your life, but completely lose the battle, lose the war, as it were, because you've never looked at what the purpose of the arguments was. Now, it's difficult to sometimes sort of interpret things heavily. You're right. Well, something like that, nihilistic. Yes, I think there's some sort of issue that. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons. So nihilistic says semantics is the idea that the argument can't be won by word or language alone. And I think it means is when you accuse people of being semantics, an academic point, making an academic point, it can't be won by word or language alone. And this is kind of the point of the philosopher. This is kind of the point that Plato's making against the sophist. You're not really winning anything. You're not getting knowledge. You're not winning anything other than the little argument itself, and it's not orientated towards, as it were, the right goal. Now, at the end of the Sophist, the last kind of move, the last 5 pages or so, we see the identification of who the Sophist is. And so this is from 264c. Okay, if you're looking at the pagination of the Sophist, 264c through to the end, or if you're looking at if you're in the Free University River, if you're looking at the Sophist version 2 PDF, which is a text from a person called Benjamin Jowett, which is then you're looking at from pages 83. In fact, that text that we're looking at is a kind of summarised version of this. Ben Jowett was actually a friend of Florence Nightingale and one of those big Oxford people in the 1880s, and it's 1892 this is. And so if you go and look at that last 5 pages, what happens is it sorry about that is it follows a discussion of truth and falsity, and the reason that discussion comes up is because when looking for the false appearance, a counter argument would be that there's no falsity. This is how it's presented. There's no such thing as falsity. There's no non-being in the world, and therefore there can't be a false appearance. There can only be appearances. And so once they've established or re-established the distinction between the true and the false, after they've re-established that something like non-being exists, which that's the kind of centre of the Sophist, that kind of strange discussion around being and non-being. But once they've done that, they get to this sort of next, the final act. And this final act is what goes from 264c, or as I say, page 83 of version 2. Now, this final act goes through another series of divisions. It kind of recapitulates some and produces some new ones. But one of the things it does is right at the centre of this. It makes this really strange. It makes this really important distinction between 2 types of creation, 2 types of production. Now, if you remember, the Sophist is someone who produces something. They're someone who creates something. They're someone who's got expertise or art in something, and we kind of tracked them through this. We've given them the credit of producing something, but we're trying to say that they're producing a falsity or they're trying to deceive us, and it's more than just a falsity. It's more than just an error. They're trying to produce something that's not real. And that's kind of the argument that Plato wants to, or the visitor from Elia wants to be able to present. And so once they've managed to bring back in truth and falsity and re-establish it, they've then got to establish how they can make a distinction between a real way of doing philosophical argument, let's say, and a wrong way or an unreal way of doing it. And the right-wrong is kind of... That's often the way we want to talk about it, but in fact we're talking about the real way of doing it and the not real way of doing it. The real way of arguing and the unreal way of arguing. The real way of arguing is that which the philosopher does, and the unreal way is that which the Sophist does, but the Sophist is presenting, is giving the appearance, is producing the likeness of a philosopher. So they look like they're doing the same thing as the philosopher. And this is the problem. Okay, is that Socrates, Plato, the visitor from Elia, they want to make a distinction here between the real philosophy and the unreal way that looks just like philosophy but is somehow illegitimate or unreal. And what they talk about what they do is they try to track the Sophist into someone who's producing likenesses, mimicking, all these kind of things. But at the heart of it, the way they make the distinction is by splitting creation itself into 2 forms, human and divine. And it's this split here, right towards the end, that it's a kind of bizarre move. You're reading through this and it suddenly pops up, this split. And you can kind of see that it's kicking around in the background because they're talking about, the gods in a little bit. But this split between 2 types of creation, this is a very, very radical kind of split that's being produced here. And it's on the basis of this that they begin to kind of organise the way in which the real philosophy and the unreal appearance of philosophy can be distinguished. Now, plainly, the philosopher is the one who has a relationship to the divine. I mean, the philosopher is the real thing. We're all talking to God or talking to the truth, or we all have some relationship to the transcendent, the divine in that sense, and that's what makes what we're doing legitimate, or that's what makes what we're doing real philosophy. But the way in which that's articulated, I mean, let's just say, apart from the fact that it's enormously question-begging as to why it's us, the philosophers, doing this and not the sophists. But the way in which the distinction is sort of articulated is through a kind of public-private distinction in one hand, and through a sincere or insincere distinction on the other hand. So let's just have a quick look at the sincere one. So, I mean, that's another way of describing the real philosopher as against the sophist who just got the appearance of a philosopher, is that the real philosopher is sincere, and the sophist is insincere. Now, we all know that there is such a thing as insincerity, again, a form of deception, but a form of deception that is not a falsity. It's a telling you what you want to hear, perhaps, but not necessarily a falsity. And so deception, insincerity, dissembling, even things like irony or sarcasm, all of these are kind of ways of insincerely saying something. Now, that way of saying and not saying something, I mean, that might be a way in which we want to kind of think about it. So a way of something being said and not said at the same time. Now, obviously, what's not said is incredibly difficult to determine here. But that distinction between the sincere, the insincere, or the simple and the dissembling, that distinction has to rely upon something other than appearance. I mean, that's what's crucial here, is they both, almost by default, almost by stipulation, they both, we can say, appear exactly the same. And so, in what sense, where can this unreal element arrive? Well, as I said, for someone like Plato or the visitor familiar, it's to do with this, purpose perhaps in which they're engaging in argument. And what's going on here is this kind of articulation of a kind of human being, a figure of the human who is, let's say, fundamentally deceptive. Okay, I mean this is a difficult one, but I think this is what's kind of underlying this process. Is that the image or the model of the human that's inherent in Plato is one in which we're fundamentally deceived. This is the allegory of the cave, for example. We're fundamentally deceived. Now, this sense in which we live a life in which appearance itself is deceit. From that, we begin to get this constant strain towards the transcendent, towards some realm of truth, towards some criteria for truth. But the difficulty is encountering in that struggle to get to some kind of truth we can hold on, because all of appearance is in a sense deceit. In the attempt to do this, we engage in the method of the dialectic, but the method itself is obviously, has a transcendent purpose and has an appearance. And so we're kind of in this sort of sense in which the philosopher and the distinction can only operate if we already assume that there's something like a transcendent fixed realm of truth, and that truth is fixed forever, fixed above. It's solid, it's sorted, it's there. But without making that assumption, which has to be an assumption because there's no argument here that gets to us to that point. Without making that assumption, it's really, really difficult to work out quite what this sincere and insincere relationship is. Now, just a brief, pedagogic moment, let's say. One of the things that's important in this final move is there is a distinction made between the statesman and the sophist. So let's say between the politician and the sophist. Okay, and this might help us to think a little bit about this relationship we have to these figures as they're presented, and to think about them in terms of our everyday life. And so the statesman is someone who puts, public long speeches, they say, in which this kind of use of argument as in an insincere way is deployed, and the private, speeches, often short speeches, doing the same kind of thing. These are the ones of the sophist. The sophist is kind of like doing this process of arguing for arguing's sake in private, and the politician is doing it in public, but they're essentially engaged in the same kind of process. There's also a clear distinction between people who mimic and people who imitate, who know the person, who know the thing that they're imitating, and people who imitate a kind of more abstract category. And so one of the ways in which they talk about that is people imitating another human being who they have to then know. They have to kind of have some capacity to draw upon their senses, as it were, to sort of pick up what that person looks like so that they can imitate them. And on the other hand, the sophist, who kind of imitates justice or knowledge, imitates knowing, imitates being just. And of course, you moved immediately into this kind of abstract realm here. Now, at the heart of this question, let's say the question of the sophist is this person sincere? And the answer, if they're a sophist, is no. At the heart of that is not an argument, really. I mean, at the heart of this is a kind of distinction that we're being pushed continuously towards. Not one that, and one that makes sense in a way. This is not an argument. This is not a distinction that doesn't make sense. But we're making this, at the heart of this, we're making this distinction between the sincere and the insincere on the basis of some kind of judgment that we're making about the person themselves. They become not just someone who's making a mistake, not just someone who's making an error, not just someone who's even perhaps lying to you a little bit. What they're doing is deeply, deeply deceptive. This is what's so problematic. This is why the simulacra that is the sophist supposedly becomes a kind of horror, because they're engaged in this deeply deceptive mode of being. And we have to be able to judge at what point being is deceptive and at what point being is real, because appearance can't give us this, because they both appear the same. And I think this horror of the insincere, this horror of the capacity of the politician perhaps to lie and to deceive us, this, I think, perhaps motivates quite strongly some of what's going on in Plato. I mean, part of the reason I say that is because if you look at some of the letters that he makes, there's a couple of letters, for example, they're often packaged up with the Phaedrus. Letters where he's talking about politics. There's a very, very negative approach towards what the human being is, as I say, and as kind of fundamentally deceptive and fundamentally deceived. And I think this image of the human is one that I think, again, this kind of image of the human is tied quite strongly to the relationship we might have to each other, to other human beings within the city. In the seminar, we're going to look a little bit more closely at this section of the Sophist. But one of the things I just want to do at the end is just to sort of emphasize this sense in which what we're doing when we're looking at Plato and what we're doing when we're looking at Deleuze's critique and his reading of Plato is taking a step away from the arguments themselves without ignoring them, a step sort of to the side, if you like, in which we kind of talk about the way in which these original arguments of Plato were framed, what kind of problems they were addressing, and at the heart of that is to think about the changing nature of subjective relations. Okay, in other words, the changing nature of what it is to be a human being, what kind of things we can do. Now, one of the reasons we might want to think about that is because I think we're living through something like a similar moment Philosophy kind of pops up quite often when we're living through similar moments. So we could say, for example, that Kant and Hegel pop up at the time at which the American and French revolutions occur, and there's a changing relationship, a changing nature of subjective relations. And I think now, at the point at which we've got the internet and we've got AI, those are changing the nature of what it is to be a human being. And in this situation, certain problems pop up. Certain kind of ways of thinking about our different relationships pop up. Now, at the point at which Plato's operating, that kind of the way, learning to speak, learning to lie, deception, all these kind of things are fundamental, and perhaps this privacy and internality thing is being developed, and so that may be kind of connected into the kind of gap that's there between appearance and reality. And as I say, there's also this kind of different relationship between politics with a big P, with a small p, and with the psychic P, if you like. And so I think if we try and think about that framework in which Plato's working, perhaps in analogy to the framework in which we're currently working, we can begin to kind of step sideways from the arguments themselves to look at what those arguments are intended to produce, what effects and what results those arguments are intended to produce. And for the Sophist, one of the things that it seems clear that it's trying to produce is a sense that we can be deceived by people who know, which plainly is a problem for a philosopher. And a sense that deception within argument is an extremely serious problem, and one that the philosopher has to deal with. And that sense of deception as destructive to the project of philosophy, I think, is something that's arising very clearly when we encounter the Sophist. And we might, as I say, we might want to ask, why this problem of deception? Why this problem of deception? Anyway, that's it for today. We'll be back next week for the last session. As I say, if you're in the Free University Brighton, I will start the seminar at 8:05. I'll open the room in a second, so you can join anyway. And if you're not in Free University Brighton, then you can get in touch through Discord if you want. Thanks for your time, and I'll see you next week, maybe.